being honest with yourself about who you really are and what you really want and what you don't want to deal with is probably one of the best money decisions you can make long term.
Welcome to Living Not So Fabulously, where financial freedom means ditching the cliches and choosing peace of mind over hustle culture. Nick Wolny is a writer, editor, and newly minted author of Money Proud, the queer guide to generate wealth, slay debt, and build good habits to secure your future.
Once a classical French horn player and an accidental entrepreneur who burned through $30,000 in savings, Nick now helps people reimagine money as both a practical tool and a source of pride. He's here to dish on student loans, hustle culture and in the age of inflation and tariffs, and budgeting for your best life. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course. So we're going to start off a little bit differently than we have in previous interviews, because you brought something up in your book that we haven't actually touched on before, but you said that personal finance was almost like a spiritual journey for you. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, it was scary to lead with that because if we think about queer culture in general and perhaps even just mainstream culture, spirituality can start to go sideways, when it gets off and running. But I think for me, my background is that I was in entrepreneurship. I was a self-employed consultant, just, quiet, happy consultant for several years. And then a few years ago, I moved into media, mainly personal finance media, and just kind of noticed a lot of this collision between personal finance and queer culture and where the two are sometimes dissonant with one another. And how do we bridge that gap? Just through osmosis, when you work in personal finance media, you happen to get more diligent with your personal finances because you're writing and editing about it all day long. And so for me, it was this exercise in thinking about where I was spending my money, thinking about how I was taking what was coming in and what I was putting it towards, and whether or not that was actually really fulfilling for me. Certainly in terms of meeting my needs and things like that, but then also in terms of my identity as a gay man and figuring out what that looks like and what I don't want to necessarily skimp on. And so as a result, what other adjustments would I have to make in order to make it all work in the budget? And so for me, that exercise, the particular point of that exercise of sitting down and figuring out, what I wanted in my life, the direction that I wanted to go, the kind of life that I wanted to cultivate and curate, that ended up being a practice that felt spiritual in a way. I'm not a religious person. I wasn't raised around any sort of religion or anything like that. But that spirituality component, and I think sort of the direction and the purpose that inherently comes up from that kind of work, was really compelling for me. And so it was interesting to reflect on that in writing the book manuscript and determining that that's just something that I think a lot of people experience when it comes to money and using money management as a vehicle for them to think about what they want in their lives.
Yeah, totally.
I definitely appreciate that. More often than not, we ask these questions when we want to do something with purpose, right? Whether you're serving a higher calling or you're organizing your life, you start to ask, why am I here? What am I doing? What do I really want my life to look like? And that's both of them are the questions that people ask when they're trying to serve a God or they're trying to serve a better life. And I appreciate that you tied that in, because not many people think about that idea of spirituality and finances going together unless they really have that direction and purpose in how they use their money.
Yeah, and I think it also is something that comes up in budgeting. I think it's in the budgeting chapter where I make the joke that budgeting culture is like 4 DNA strands away from diet culture. That often it feels restrictive inherently. Many people just keep it at arm's length because of the restrictive nature of it, or that it often has those vibes to it. And so I think that was what was most interesting to me in terms of determining longevity and consistency. And so much of budgeting is just about cultivating something that can be sustainable for you. And so I think that was just something that I wanted to cultivate throughout this book. And I think people should look at in their own personal finances is really this this personal inquiry of, all right, what are those different shades of gray that might apply to my situation? With spending, with income. For me personally, my background was in classical music. That's what I went to school for. And I think I make that joke in the introduction. I was shocked to discover that a master's in classical French horn is not the most valuable degree on planet Earth for getting employed. And so I had to pivot. I had to try different things. I had to transfer my skills. I will always be a champion of a fine arts degree. I think there's things that it helps you bring to the table that you just don't get in other lines of education. But on its face, it's not as employable as, say something in computer science or cybersecurity. And so there's a little bit of relearning to do, a little bit of reskilling to do, and to just bite that bullet and do the things that will actually move that needle in terms of either making substantially more money or trimming back substantially on expenses. And so I think that's doing that inquiry and just really coming to terms with that and telling yourself the truth about how it's actually going is one of the most important things you can do.
Yeah, we're absolutely going to dive more into that. If you're just tuning in, this is Living Not So Fabulously, where we mix a cocktail of shame-free money talk. We're speaking with finance journalist and author Nick Wolny. So you just shared about how you went to school for classical French horn, and that wasn't necessarily the most lucrative career path. With the growing student loan debt crisis and seemingly no support from Washington anytime soon, what's your advice to graduates who are struggling with finding a job, especially ones commensurate with their student loans?
Well, I think that's true for most degrees right now. I think job security itself is becoming an increasingly antiquated term. Even people, yeah, I went to University of Illinois for undergrad, and that was a fabulous school and is a fabulous school for computer science, for example. And so kind of the talk on campus was, well, if you're in comp sci, you're pretty much set for life. But then, a piece actually came out, I think it was in New York Times last year, talking about how for computer scientists, the skills that are being learned in college now are more directly relevant. Computer scientists my age did not learn machine learning at university. And now it is absolutely essential that that's one of the core things you learn because that's so much of what it is now, right? So nothing's guaranteed. I mean, the medicine, law, everything is changing so much. And so I think what comes up with college and with university is pursuing the things that you're passionate about, pursuing things that are related to continuing to educate yourself and actually developing those skills, because it's through that process that you're going to figure out what you actually want to do. I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, right? I don't know if the two of you know yet. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And so so I think it does have to be looked at as an investment in your intellectual capital, so to speak, right? And just being able to think critically, and also the college experience. For me, I grew up in the rural Midwest. I grew up not around any gay people. It was absolutely my game plan to stay in the closet when I was in high school and get the biggest, fattest scholarship I could to get as far away as I could for college so that I could start my new life coming out as a gay man and learn how to be gay as an adult, living on my own. That was actually a substantial factor for me in terms of my academic motivation. I didn't care that much about math, but I was going to do well in math class in order to potentially pursue that financial solution and pursue that solution for my young adult life to go to school, to get away from home and to get that experience of living by myself and being in a new city and making new friends. And so I think that investment, a lot of it involves that. And so what young people nowadays need to do with all of this, rising student loan debt and just the cost of college becoming really exorbitant is determining, does a 4-year university or does a master's program or a PhD program, is that totally necessary in order to deliver that same coming of age experience that a lot of us want as queer people in particular? I think true for all people, but queer people in particular. And can that be replicated in something like a community college experience? Or, does it have to, can you take a gap year? It's pretty normalized in other countries to not be on this runaway train of higher education for years and years and years. So it'll be interesting to see what unfolds. I think particularly next year as some of the big, beautiful bill elements go into effect, starting with the 26-27 school year. You have a lot of young people who are going to have to just look at how they're investing in their education and their career and, what things college is giving them and what things college is not giving them, and make some decisions about what they want out of that experience and out of that investment.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting, having worked with the LGBTQ community for, like, a decade now or more, it always seems that, especially gay men, but maybe that's just anecdotal experience, that we always feel like we need to get more education, and we'll go into hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loan debt to escape something, like whether it's escaping our home or escaping our current job or escaping the socioeconomic class that we're in, or maybe even escaping, how we feel about ourselves because of years of bullying and being picked on. What's your advice to the gay community specifically, around the acquisition of more credentials and the paying for those credentials?
I think you can do it in a variety of ways, and it doesn't always have to be a structured multi-year academic institution. I recently experienced that personally. So, I got done with my 6 years of French horn education at higher learning, and quickly became very resentful that I had spent all that money on those pieces of paper, right? And so I didn't look at any continuing education for many years, other than small things like online courses or maybe a local workshop, things like that. And then when I pivoted into media, um, I was good at the storytelling piece. I was good at finding the sources. I was good at finding interesting scoops and things like that. But I was less great at writing in a journalistic style, and I very quickly started getting my butt kicked, and I was like, "Oh god, I'm gonna be laid off so quick, like, it's revolving door for me, I'm coming in and just going right back out." And so, I got the help I needed at work, but it also just kind of made me more passionate about journalism. So I ended up doing a journalism certificate at UCLA. It was almost entirely online. It was great. It was an 8-course certificate. UCLA actually used to have a journalism major, and they converted it into a certificate to make it more cost effective, because there were more people who wanted to learn journalism who either couldn't get into UCLA or couldn't go because UCLA has a whole thing going on with, how competitive it is. And yeah, the first class was reporting one, and I kind of turned my nose up at that at the beginning, and I walk in, and one was in a 15-person class. I was one of only 3 American students. Everyone else was visiting from another country, and so that was a great experience to hear about, just writing and media and storytelling from all those perspectives. But the teacher used to be the news director at KTLA here in Los Angeles, and he was the news director during the O.J. Simpson trial. And so he was able to, like, the first hour of this night school, one night a week, was him just like telling stories from the trenches of like what it was like to direct the local TV station during the O.J. Simpson trial. And it was just this like everyone just on the edge of their seat, and they're like, "I can't believe this class was only $500." And we're like, it's just so many great experiences there. And I think it rekindled my love of learning and transformed my love of learning. And then also within the certificate, I was able to develop other skills. Like had to take some electives. So I took Final Cut Pro, I took literary journalism, I took Photoshop, I took, just kind of broadening my creator skill set, I would say, and my storytelling skill set. But it made me fall back in love with learning, and also made me unlearn the idea that continuing education can only look like this one thing, or it has to be this one thing. But then for many gay men in particular, there's still that overcompensation trigger that happens, and that continues to sort of drive their lives, whether it's hypermasculinity physically, or overperforming in your career, or you're the one who always has the quip in the Zoom chat. You're just running your mouth in that Zoom chat. Whatever it is, it's just that, like, the root of it deep down is often trying to overcompensate for something. Right, trying to be better, trying to be more educated, trying to be more fit, trying to look good, trying to be the most interesting looking person at the function, most stylish person at the function, and then kind of like the financial downfall that happens as a result of that. So I do think that, and even with the book as well, that's what it touches on in the very first chapter, is that for many of us, the majority, if not all of our financial decisions are often drawn from this experience of overcompensation, or trying to course correct and fit in. And so being honest with yourself about who you really are and what you really want and what you don't want to deal with, is probably one of the best money decisions you can make long term.
Absolutely. And we're going to dive into that. But one moment, we'll be right back after this quick break. Welcome back to Living Not So Fabulously. We're back talking with Nick Wolny, the author of the new book, Money Proud, The Queer Guide to Generate Wealth, Slay Debt, and Build Good Habits to Secure Your Future. So we just talked a little bit about the need for many in the LGBTQ plus community to overcompensate for maybe insecurities or inadequacies that they may feel as they enter into adulthood. You write in Money Proud that queer culture sometimes clashes with personal finance because queer life celebrates the now and having all the flashy, shiny stuff. And David and I still believe that many in our community are kind of we're still kind of getting over the HIV/AIDS pandemic, where we're not all necessarily trying to live for today because tomorrow we will die. Why do you think there's this confluence of challenges for the community, and what can we do to change that? Maybe most importantly, how can we get more LGBT people's attention to finally take action with their finances?
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that regarding this sort of fog of mortality that kind of sits over the community sometimes, even if it's not for gay men specifically, just, knowing that there's this part of our recent history that was about, like I'd say I should have hundreds of thousands of mentors in their 60s and 70s right now. And they don't, and we don't, because they passed away in their 20s and 30s, and our federal government ignored it for years. So unsurprisingly, my POV on personal finance is like as little Social Security focus as possible. You know what I mean? Just like as little federal government getting involved as possible, just in case. Um, but I do think that the personal finance has a lot of purity culture ingrained in it, right? It's about austerity, it's about less, and I think queer culture is very much of like a kind of a reaction to that, a living in the now, even just the experience of, what does fully expressing yourself look like? And for many people that there's an external facet of that, or there's a physical expression of that. And that's not to clamp down on things like style and adventure and stuff like that, like certainly continue to be fabulous. But I think another factor that is hopefully causing more queer people to be interested in finance is that more queer people want to buy houses. More queer people want to start families. That's one of the biggest ones. And that decision to develop that nuclear family really forces some hard conversations about your money, what you're doing with your money, how you're going to save your money, things like that. And so I do think that there's something interesting swirling around with queer people leaning it more into personal finance. There's also just what's happening societally. You've got whispers of a recession. We've had that for a few years now, though, so it kind of ebbs and flows. But also queer people wanting to cultivate safety and security. And as things go down to the states more and more, a lot of queer people are having to pick up and move states. They're looking at like, okay, I need to pick up and move to another state, for my safety, or to go to a state that has better protections for who I am as a person. Sadly, that's becoming more and more common. My other thought, and this is how I approached the book, the book forced me to kind of change my writing voice, or sort of evolve my writing voice. I joked with the editor that I've sort of found my Charizard writing voice in this book, which is, just fire breathing and very camp and, just totally going there. Is that you have to convince people that it was their idea to be responsible with their money, and you have to meet them where they are. I like to joke, I believe in inception, right? If you want it to stick, you got to convince people that it was their idea in the first place, to take action. And so, I think what that looks like for queer people is introducing them to some of the basics of money, but doing it in a way that's really friendly and meets them where they are. And, I think the joke when we introduce mutual funds is it's like when drag brunch is ticketed. So it's got a cost, it's a little bit higher production value, but, it's a little bit more nuanced as a result. Just looking for things like that can meet people where they are from a place of familiarity. And then, providing that sort of infotainment, that education, but in a fun way, and to where people, they read the book and they feel good while they're doing it, while also learning something about a resource that is just ubiquitous. It's unless you find the sugar daddy, you're never gonna get away from the day-to-day money management and things like that. And also with what is just kind of going on societally, it's important to get in that driver's seat with how you're going to take action on your own money and not necessarily wait for the right ratio of representatives in Congress or for certain, I think student loans was a really good example for people where we were kind of strung along for quite a while on what the forgiveness conversation was. And now it seems like, at least in the near term, that ship has largely sailed. And so I think the most proactive approach you can take is, keep that in your line of sight in terms of what's going on with government and what's going on with economics and with society and things like that. But in your day-to-day, counting on some sort of policy being passed that's going to save your butt, probably not the best personal finance move. The best personal finance move is going to be to focus on what you want, and then do the numbers and figure out how to get it.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times we've gotten comments, especially on social media, where people say, my financial planning is either dying young or marrying rich. And we always say, well, how many sugar daddies do you think are actually out there? And don't you think they're already all scooped up? Like,
Yeah.
how far
Yeah.
is that strategy going to go?
Yeah, and I think it also, we say it in jest and it's fun, but I think also for people, even just realizing the basics of looking at your money, and I think there's also, I think that this is an expression of numbing for many people, kind of a shop the pain away. And then you get to the end of the line, then the credit cards are maxed out, and like you can't sustain any longer what you're doing. And for young people in particular, I think the stat is 1 in 7 Gen Z consumers, their credit cards already maxed out. And that they are adopting credit cards and running credit cards up to the max quicker than millennials did when millennials were the age that Gen Z is now, right? So it's not just it's in your 20s kind of thing. Like all of the economic data is there pretty clearly that for them, there are more forces, there are more debt forces, and higher interest debt, pressuring them more than we had at their age. And so it just kind of the malaise of it all is just like, oh, well, I'm never going to pay this off, so who cares? Let's do it. But it's like
Yeah.
pulling that back a little bit and getting honest can really help you out.
Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us. We appreciate having you today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. If you have questions or you have guest suggestions for us, just email yfpodcast@yahooinc.com.
Finally, if you like what you see, scan the QR code to follow Yahoo Finance Podcast for more videos and expert insights, because when you do, you'll slay debt, build wealth, and still have money for martinis. And until next time, stay fabulous.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.